Knowles. In this presentation, I will review the censorship of women in the media. To do so, I will cover 5 major topics: the history of women's rights, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, non-disclosure agreements, the film She Said, and After She Said. First, let's review the history of women's rights in the United States. According to Tigris and Schwartz in their 2022 article, Women's Rights, and DeWitt's 2020 article, The 19th Amendment is a milestone but not an endpoint, women have been advocating for their rights for centuries. However, in this section, I will review the history of women's rights after the year 1964. After white women were granted the right to vote, Tigris and Schwartz explained that women face sex-based discrimination and sex stereotypes. As a result, the tolerance for sexual violence and harassment towards women was perpetual in and out of the workplace. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prevented employers from discriminating against their employees based on sex, which allowed women to challenge their employers. However, female employees continue to be manipulated and intimidated by employers. Finally, the 2017 investigation against film mogul Harvey Weinstein triggered the Me Too movement, which is explored in Schrader's film She Said. The Me Too movement is an ongoing movement that protests sexual violence against women. Within this movement, victims have an identified community to share their experiences. As a result, abusers are brought to justice, and the harmful ideologies, such as boys will be boys, are dismantled. With more knowledge in the media, people can learn to recognize that the abusers cause sexual violence, not the victims. Next, let's explore Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, the women responsible for investigating Harvey Weinstein and triggering the Me Too movement. According to the 2018 article Jodi Kantor from Gale Biography, several of Jodi Kantor's investigations have led to positive change. For example, she investigated how difficult it can be for hourly workers to breast pump on the job. As a result, several corporations have implemented lactation pods. According to the 2018 article Megan Twohey from Gale Biography, Kantor has uncovered several challenges facing women and children. As illustrated in Schrader's film She Said, Kantor wanted to investigate systemic sexism in Hollywood. After many sources pointed to Weinstein's pattern of violence against women and the NDAs used to silence them, she asked Twohey to join her mission, as Twohey had previously investigated Donald Trump. Before diving into Schrader's film She Said, let's quickly review non-disclosure agreements. An NDA is a legal document that prevents both signing parties from speaking out about the information listed in the document. According to Zakreski's 2022 article, NDAs can muzzle sexual harassment victims. Although initially meant to hide sensitive company information from the public, NDAs have been used to silence victims in the event of sexual assault, as victims face potential legal consequences for speaking out. For example, Schrader's film She Said illustrates a handful of cases in which Weinstein's victims were unable to legally share their stories with Twohey and Kantor, as the victims were manipulated or intimidated into signing an NDA. As a result, this threatens freedom of speech and expression and freedom of the press. Zakreski continues to note that states such as California and New Jersey have passed laws to ensure that NDAs do not apply to the events of sexual misconduct and illegal activity. However, they do not apply to everyone. In addition, victims may still feel fearful of how their abusers may react if they share their stories. Today, Reps Lois Frankel and Ken Buck proposed a bill called Speak Now, which prevents employers from using NDAs when women need to speak out about sexual misconduct. Now let's move on to the Schrader's film She Said. The film illustrates Kantor and Twohey's experiences investigating Weinstein. Throughout the film, audiences are subject to political and cultural implications of censorship through the depiction of Kantor and Twohey's challenges while attempting to provide public forum to victims to share their testimonies. Overall, Weinstein felt incredibly threatened by both Kantor and Twohey, as depicted in the film and noted in the 2018 article biography Jodi Kantor. Kantor and Twohey were on a mission to expose his pattern of sexual violence against women. As a result, it would threaten his career and incriminate him. In turn, Weinstein would verbally threaten the journalists over the phone or intimidate their sources into prolonged silence. Although Weinstein's legal team approached Kantor and Twohey, the 2018 Gale Biography article states the institution was willing to stand up to somebody powerful, willing to lose advertising to do the story. Although there are several victims, we will focus on the testimonies of 3 women who, through Schrader's film She Said, highlight various cultural, political, and economic implications of censorship: Zelda Perkins, Rowena Chu, and Ashley Judd. In the film, Zelda Perkins relays her experience to Jodi Kantor, describing how Weinstein would grow more aggressive with her and attempt to assault and or rape her while she attempted to complete her inappropriate responsibilities as an assistant. Then Rowena Chu, a colleague and close friend of Perkins, was raped by Weinstein. Together, the 2 women tried to report him to the authorities, but as young women, neither knew how to find a lawyer. Eventually, when they found a lawyer, they had no case and they had no physical evidence and no police report. As a result, Perkins Chu agreed to sign an NDA. Consequently, the women remained silent and Weinstein continued to write multiple women. In Zakreski's 2022 article, she explains NDAs have contributed to a culture of silence around sexual harassment. The possibility of legal retaliation is enough to keep workers from coming forward. In addition to Perkins and Chu, several of the women were fearful to come forward with their stories of abuse as they were fearful of retaliation. In the film, Perkins tells Cantor that NDAs apply not only to legal institutions but to therapists, friends, and families. For example, Chu hadn't even told her husband. However, this was not solely because of the NDA. Chu notes that in addition to the NDA, she stayed silent because of her cultural upbringing. She explains that she is Christian and Chinese, both of which are conservative cultures with conventional ideologies about one's sexuality. Neither community served as an environment that she could share her experiences with. Moreover, this serves as an example as to why the Me Too movement is so important, as it provides an environment and platform for victims to share their experiences. Next, Ashley Judd explains that Weinstein blackballed her career, highlighting the economic implications of censorship. For example, she notes that several movies in which she had the role for were consequently taken from her. In addition, she explains that she wrote an article about Weinstein's abuse. Although she didn't explicitly state his name, Hollywood knew who she was referring to and did not take action to protect other women. Also, she points to her cultural implications of censorship such as sexism. For example, during the women's rights protest, she quoted President Donald Trump. Later, she lost an advertising gig, stating, "He used that language and got elected. I quoted him and got fired." In his 2024 article, What Does Weinstein's Reversal Mean for Me Too?, James Barron explains that although the Weinstein case was initially found guilty, the Weinstein case was overturned in 2024. First, there were several cracks in the case. A detective failed to turn in the evidence that the judge dismissed as part of the indictment, and there was an over-reliance on victims as there was no physical evidence to be used. In addition, there were 90 women to testify against Weinstein, yet not all of them included the case because A, not all of the crimes occurred in Manhattan, and B, several of them were outside of the statute of limitations. Without physical evidence, they hoped to illustrate a pattern of victims. However, Weinstein's defense claimed that he had an unfair trial. Regardless of legal implications, the public was shocked. As aforementioned, 90 women came forward, and still he was not charged in New York. According to the 2018 Gill biography article Jodi Kantor, the 2017 article published by Toohey and Kantor, quotes, gave voice to victims of Weinstein's sexual harassment. Although most definitely a blow, the Me Too movement is not defined by a single case. However, it's unclear how this may impact victims from stepping forward. Barron continues to state, many survivors of assault do not report sexual abuse to the law enforcement because of how they've been treated by the law enforcement when they have. Lastly, although not found guilty in New York, he is guilty of a crime in California and remains in prison.